Today we're talking about the true self, and we'll talk about what that means from a variety of different perspectives today, both psychological and spiritual, generally speaking. But I want to also highlight that in our book, The Enneagram Guide to Waking Up, we framed that book in terms of a 3-step or 3-stage journey to make it simple and accessible for people to understand something about the growth path for each of the 9 types and the 27 subtypes. And generally speaking, we talked about the growth path in terms of a first step of kind of waking up to what your type is, and that by learning about your type, you can become much more conscious and aware of yourself and really create big shifts in your life. And we also then the second step would be facing the shadow. And the third step is moving more toward manifesting more of what we might call a true self or higher self, or we also could say more of who you really are. Because what the Enneagram helps us understand is the personality or defensive self-structure that we identify with starting in childhood and growing into adulthood. And we need that personality to survive, to make our way through life. But by the time we reach adulthood, it's really important to recognize that who we think we are is not really who we are. That the personality type that we may think of as who we are is not all of who we are. It's only that part of us that developed to survive in the world, to cope with whatever we encountered starting in childhood. Now, as children, it's really important that we adapt to our environment in order to survive, to grow psychologically. And we need a kind of protective self-structure, which is the personality, in order to have a kind of resilience. If some of our needs don't get met, if we go through traumas, if we get wounded by various things psychologically, emotionally, it's really important that our personality develops in order, almost like a shock absorber or a set of buffers to help us grow and develop without being too impacted negatively by whatever's going on in the outside world. So psychologically, we might think of the personality as a false self. And in object relations theory, which some of you may have heard me talk about before, many of the theorists that describe the development, psychological development, starting in childhood, talk about what we develop in order to cope and survive as a kind of false self. And they contrast this false self to a truer self that is thought of as who we innately are, what our capacities, inborn strengths, particular characteristics that make us who we are. Now, this parallels perfectly with what Gurdjieff talked about. And of course, Gurdjieff is the person behind a lot of what we know about the Enneagram symbol, especially as a symbol of transformation. And he also elaborated a program of self-work called The Work, or the Fourth Way, that described what people need to do to really become aware of themselves and their mechanical habits, to wake up, because he said mankind was in some ways asleep or sleepwalking through life without knowing it. And so that what Gurdjieff said very much parallels what psychological theorists say. For instance, he said that there's personality and there's essence. This might be roughly equal to what psychotherapists and psychologists call in the same time in the 20th century, the false self and the true self. Now, what Gurdjieff said is personality is what is not one's own, and essence is what is one's own. So we can think of this as a really good parallel for what we understand in psychology, which is that when we're born into this world, we're not a blank slate. We come in as who we are, but we develop a personality, which might be thought of as a set of defensive or adaptive coping strategies to survive in the world and even thrive to a certain point of development. But in adulthood, when we have the urge to grow, when we realize that in some ways our personality or our false self limits us in ways we tend not to see because it's so familiar and because we've been doing it so long. So what is the true self in psychological terms, according to object relations theorists and other psychological theorists? It's the part of ourselves that in some ways we had to allow to kind of go in the background, or that we couldn't express in childhood because it would leave us vulnerable. It didn't match up with the characteristics or traits or patterns or habits or strategies of the false self that we needed to develop in order to survive. So human children are very, very sensitive, as some of us know from having been human children. And the idea is that from an early stage, really from birth, we are exquisitely sensitive to what's happening in our environment and what we need to do to meet the environment, to protect ourselves and to feel okay. And the false self develops, object relations theorists would say, often in response to what's happening in the outside world around us, exactly the way Gurdjieff said. So for instance, let's say you have an anxious mother. As a baby, you'll be very tuned into what kinds of things that you just tend to do automatically or just as an expression of who you are that intensify her anxiety. And the baby and the child later gets very aware and adaptive to what will help the mother and what may intensify her difficulty or anxiety. So for instance, as a human child, I sense that, oh, when I cry, that makes things worse in the world out there. So maybe I, over time, try to suppress that cry. So again, it's the idea is that we develop all these different patterns and habits through adapting to our environment in very nuanced ways, in different ways, and that the accumulation of those adaptations equals up to a kind of false self, a person that we needed to be to, in some ways, interface with or interconnect with people in the outside world in the way that we could maximize getting our needs met. Now, that could be need for connection or attachment, which is a really, really important primary need. And a lot of psychological theorists talk about attachment theory and attachment, starting with John Bowlby, who is really the pioneer in talking about attachment. There's a great book by Robert Caron, and I can't remember the exact title, but it's all about attachment. And there's a lot of data to show that we really, really, really need to be attached to our caregivers as a way of surviving. And so in order to maximize the potential for attachment, sometimes under traumatic circumstances, the human baby, the human child accentuates or emphasizes or develops more of the parts of themselves or the adaptive parts of themselves that will align with the outside world and make it so they can feel a sense of safety, well-being, holding, so that they can get most of what they need or as much of what they can get from their environment. So we can think of the false self as that automatic adaptive ability in us to build up or develop more of the aspects of ourselves in order to meet the outside world in the way where we can feel connected or safe or held. Now, again, part of the theory is just because we're raised by humans in an unconscious world, there's going to be unmet needs. There are going to be, hopefully as few as possible, but there are going to be traumas. There's going to be wounding, because if we show up completely as our true self or our essential self in a way that Gurdjieff said, it's like that essential self can't really survive in the world. It's almost like that part of us needs to be protected. So we need our false self. But in adulthood, we need to recognize the difference. And we need to get to a point when we do start doing inner work, where we start to discern the difference between the false self and the true self. Now, this is true for all of us, for all Enneagram types and subtypes. However, I want to highlight that type 3 might be the prototype for understanding exactly what I'm talking about. Because while all of us develop a false self to protect our truer self, which is more we can think of as who we essentially are in essence, who we are as almost our higher self, or that part of us that expresses our individual uniqueness, our special gifts and capacities that we're here to develop or manifest in the world. Like if we think about it, the Enneagram is a symbol of unity and multiplicity. So it's the idea that there are universal laws, universal patterns, but there's also diversity. And so when each of us can develop a false self to protect our higher self, at a certain point, if we're called to do inner work, the job is going in reverse. The job is learning about the false self that we have developed to adapt to the world as a way back to knowing more of our truer self, which is why when we teach the Enneagram, we often say your personality tells you who you are not, because that's not who you are. That's the part of you that developed to survive in the world. But it's really important to know that that true self is there and to start understanding what that means, even if it's a little bit tricky at first, because the whole purpose of the Enneagram is to help us disidentify with the false self, which helps us create space, creates room to manifest or live into or live more from our truer self or higher self, that part of us which has a capacity for the divine, for a kind of living more from a higher divine self in touch with a universal will or source. And as some spiritual traditions say, when we're born into the human world, we all have a drive in us to return to our source, to return to origin, the origin from which we came on a spiritual level. So psychologically, we do psychological work with the Enneagram, and each type and subtype can help us understand exactly what we've identified with, so that by observing it with more and more conscious awareness, we can understand or discern the difference and start letting go of, or as Helen Palmer used to say, letting the personality drop, not doing or letting go of the need to defend ourselves through the patterns and adaptations that we absolutely needed as children, so that we can be more of who we really are in the world, and whatever that means.